Martin's going to hand those out. Thank you, Brother Martin. I appreciate that. And let's review period number 11. So period number 11 is called captivity or exile. This period goes from what? What to what? The fall of the southern kingdom or destruction of the southern kingdom being Judah, and it fell to what nation? Southern. Babylon, led by old Nebu, right? If you ask my little ones. Nebuchadnezzar, except for James. James always gets it, or at least attempts it. So from the destruction or the fall of the southern kingdom to what's going to mark the end of this period, or period number 11? The decree of Cyrus that allows the Jews to return home. Cyrus being king of Persia. And of course, the reason for that, the southern kingdom, Judah, fell to Babylon. And the reason you have a Persian king who gives the decree that allows them to return home is because Babylon will fall around I think it's around 538. I've got the exact date here in my period number 12. Yes, around 538 BC, Babylon falls to the Medes and the Persians. And of course, that ends up, the Persian rulers end up it becomes more or less known as the Persian Empire. Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, they served God where? Wherever he put them, right? In the captivity. Jeremiah, let's start there. Say again? Yeah, he was in Judah, in the homeland. And of course, later on, I guess, kind of considered in period number 12. And I think I mentioned this last week. There is some overlap in 11 and 12, and you've probably noticed that already. But yeah, Jeremiah in the homeland, later on after the fall of Jerusalem, after the destruction of Jerusalem, he's going to be carried against his will, against God's will, basically kidnapped by his own brethren, taken into Egypt. They think they can run off to Egypt after of course, Nebuchadnezzar, he's going to set up a governor in Babylon he's not a king. He's just, there to, keep things in order on behalf of Babylon and make sure everything runs smoothly. But they're going to decide, some of the Israelites will come along and they're going to kill that governor. They kill him, and of course, that's the guy Babylon put in charge, so what's Babylon going to think about that? What's old Nebuchadnezzar going to think about that? He's not going to think too highly of that, obviously. So they decide, we got to get out of Dodge, and they're going to flee to Egypt because, Egypt's going to save us. And God, through Jeremiah, keeps telling them, no, this is punishment from God, this destruction of Jerusalem, the fall of the kingdom. This is God's punishment upon the nation, upon the people. Wherever you go, you're not going to escape. But they didn't listen, and so they take Jeremiah, they go into Egypt, and of course, they're going to be destroyed there in Egypt. Not Jeremiah, but the other ones. Egypt, of course, is also going to be subjected to Babylon. Daniel, where did he serve God? In Babylon, right? Actually in the city of Babylon, in the palace, if you want to get real specific. And then Ezekiel, in Babylon, but he was not necessarily in the city of Babylon. He was among the captives there by the river or the canal, Kibar. So Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, as we talked about, kind of form a prophetic circuit where God makes sure that even in captivity, even in their punishment, his people are being instructed. They're being told what they need to do to follow God faithfully. They don't always do it, but they were not without instruction. So what they were without is excuse. You can't say, well, we just didn't know. God just kind of abandoned us into captivity. No, he still gave them instruction on what to do. What happened to Jeremiah after Jerusalem fell? We pretty much just covered this, but they They took him into Egypt. His own brethren took him into Egypt with them when they fled after killing Gedaliah, the governor of Judah. Why were Daniel's 3 friends cast into a fiery furnace? They wouldn't bow down to the king's idol. We didn't really talk about this a whole lot. You kind of have to pick what you're going to cover when you're doing an overview, and this account is so familiar to us. I didn't really spend much time on that, but I think most of us are familiar with it. They wouldn't bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's idolatrous image. In chapter 2 of Daniel, he has this dream, and he's very troubled by it. He can't really remember the dream. He just knows it was something very, very frightening. It really got his attention. He's worried about it, but he can't recall the details. And so he calls for the magicians, the astrologers, and so on. And he says, you're going to have to tell me the dream and the interpretation. And of course, they're frauds. And so they say, well, you tell us the dream, and we'll tell you the interpretation. That makes it kind of easy, doesn't it? You can just make up anything. Well, here's what it means. But he says, the thing is gone from me. You're trying to buy time, is what he says, to kind of paraphrase. And he says, you're going to tell me the dream and the interpretation, or you're all going to be destroyed. They can't do it. And they say, look, you're asking something that nobody can do. Only the gods, as they say, of course, they're idolatrous. Only the gods could do this. Well, only the God could do that. And so the decree, the order goes out, kill all the wise men, supposedly, these astrologers, magicians, and so on. And Daniel hears about it, says, get me an audience with the king. There's a God in heaven. He'll make the dream known to the king. And it's interesting because when you study that account, did he have the interpretation? Did he know? It seems, when you read that, after he says that, then he gets with Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they pray to God to reveal this to them. It would seem there that that's a great, great act of faith. That Daniel says, let me have an audience with the king. God will reveal this to him. But anyway, of course, he goes on and reveals the dream. It was this great image, the head of gold, and you had the gold, silver, bronze or brass, and then the legs of iron, and of course the feet, which were iron mixed with miry clay. And it represents the 4 kingdoms. And he interprets the dream. Of course, the stone that's cut out without hands comes and smites the image, breaks it into pieces. It kind of scatters to the 4 winds, as we say, and then that kingdom fills the earth. And of course, it's a prophecy of the church. In the days of these kings, that 4th kingdom, the Roman Empire, as you begin to study that and interpret it, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, Daniel 2:44. It's not going to be left to others. It's going to break in pieces, consume all these other kingdoms, and it's going to stand forever. Probably from that dream and that interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar then decides in chapter 3, hey, I'm going to make me one of these images. So he sets up this great image, and he says, when you hear the music, you fall down and worship. Of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not do that. No indication where Daniel was at this time. Most commentators guess that Daniel was away on the king's business or something, but no. Some people have gotten crazy with speculation and say, well, Daniel must have succumbed and bowed down. There's nothing in the character of Daniel that would indicate that in any way, shape, form, or fashion. He was out of pocket in some way or another. He's not mentioned in that account. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, of course, refuse. Somebody tattles on them. The king calls them in there and says, hey, is this true that you're not bowing down to my image? They said, look, he kind of says, we're going to do a mulligan here. And we'll do this thing over again. And when you hear the music, if you fall down and worship the image, great. We're going to just forget this ever even happened. But if you don't, well, then who is that God that'll deliver you from my hands? You're going into the fiery furnace. And they said to him, again, a great, great display of faith. They say, our God is able. He's able to save us from your fiery furnace. They didn't know that God would. But they said, if not, in other words, if God chooses not to save us, we're still not bound down to your image because it's wrong. It's idolatrous. You only worship the God of heaven. He is the one true God. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar is furious, as Nebuchadnezzar was wont to get. and they heat the furnace up, 7 times hotter than it was wont to be heated, and they go, and even the men who were carrying him up there to throw him in the furnace end up being killed by the fire. It's so hot, and later on he says, "Didn't we throw 3 men in the fiery furnace? I see 4." And one is, the King James says one, it looks like the Son of God. Some people have taken that and they say, well, Jesus was with them. Second person of the Godhead is with them in the furnace. What he says there, literally, in the other translations have it a little more accurately translated. He says the fourth is like a son of the gods. In other words, he can tell this is not just a human. It could have been, we've talked before about the angel of the Lord that appears a lot in Old Testament Scripture. And there's abundant evidence that when you see that specific reference to the angel of the Lord, it's a reference to the second person of the Godhead. Maybe, maybe not, but you don't have that specific reference to go on there in Daniel chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar is still idolatrous at that point. He just says it looks like a son of the gods. He can tell it's not just a mere human. But Nebuchadnezzar kind of progresses. I know we have talked about that before. As you read the book, he progresses, statements like that to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Who is that God that'll save you if you don't listen to me? Then he, after this is over, in Daniel chapter 3, in fact, to get the exact reference, but he actually makes a statement where you can tell he's kind of coming along, if you want to use that terminology. Let's see. He says, blessed be the God, this is verse 28, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, changed the king's word, yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any God except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Earlier he had said, your God is really a God among the gods. It's kind of like saying he's the chief God. Now he's saying there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. When you get to chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is humbled. His pride, he has another dream. They bring in Daniel. Daniel interprets it for him. You're going to lose the kingdom because of your pride. And Daniel begs him, leave off your pride. Get away from that and humble yourself. He didn't listen. He ends up, he's kind of becomes like a beast, dwelling out in the field, and till 7 times pass over thee. And boy, commentators have run wild with that expression, but it seems to be just an expression to say, the 7 times there, 7 representing completion or perfection, till you learn your lesson and you learn it well. Well, he did, and in chapter 4, it seems Nebuchadnezzar has kind of come full circle. He's come all the way, and he says, there's no God like Jehovah. Maybe, who knows? It's hard to say for sure. Did Nebuchadnezzar really come to believe fully that Jehovah is the one true God and serve him and worship him? I'd like to think so. I can't say that with certainty, but I think there's some evidence that you could say, at least maybe. One of those, I'll add it to our spiritual bucket list, right? We'll find out when we get there. Let's go to the next question here. Much of Daniel deals with prophecies pertaining to what 4 world kingdoms? And in order, preferably. Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, and the Roman Empire. I'll go ahead and bring up that answer there. I had a long discussion with a gentleman years ago. This was not long after we got married. I was at Greenslake Road, and elderly gentleman, very, very fascinating fella. He invented these, he was working for some company, and he invented these little tiny, tiny LED type lights. They're not the same probably as what's used now. I'm sure that technology's come a long way, but he invented these, and you when you first started seeing these, it was really innovative and just amazing, but he invented that, discovered it, and it was really, really a neat fella. But we got into some correspondence. He was Seventh-day Adventist, but he was very, very, disappointed, disillusioned with the Seventh-day Adventist church. because of the teaching of salvation by faith only. He was really taking issue with that, and he said, I can read my Bible. I know there's more to salvation than just believing and asking Jesus into your heart or whatever. But he was also frustrated with much of the rest of, I guess for lack of a better term, Christendom, because he felt like he did believe very strongly that we should be worshiping on Saturday, the seventh day. He felt like the Sabbath law was never done away with, Ten Commandments were never done away with, the ceremonial law was done away with, but not the Ten Commandments. That's another study for another time. It's very easy to read Scripture and see that the Ten Commandments were part of the law. The ceremonial, it went right with the Ten Commandments. It was not an a la carte thing. It was a package deal. And when the ceremonial law was nailed to the cross by Jesus, so was the rest of it, including the Ten Commandments. But, by the way, Romans 7 is if you just had Romans 7, the first was within, I want to say about 7:6, where Paul says, I wouldn't have known lust except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. Well, that's not part of the ceremonial law, that's part of the Ten Commandments. And he's talking about you're dead to the law in that context. But in this discussion, one of the things that we discussed, and we was kind of written correspondence, we'd go back and forth, and very good discussion, never got ugly or anything like that, it was always respectful. But one of the things that we talked about was Daniel chapter 2. He felt like there were 5 kingdoms in Daniel 2, and the fifth, and a lot of premillennialism holds this position that the fifth is yet to come, and it's some kind of one world order. In fact, you'll hear people sometimes talk about it. Every election cycle, different events going on in the world, people talk about, well, it's just setting up things for the one world government. And that's going to be that fifth empire. And when that happens, be ready, because Jesus is going to come again. He's going to set up his kingdom. And it's all just a misunderstanding of what the kingdom is, for one thing, and when the kingdom was established, and it was. And it's also a misunderstanding of Daniel 2 and the empires. You read that in its context, and again, we don't have time to go and do an in-depth analysis. We've studied Daniel, I don't know, it's been a few years ago in our Wednesday night class, but there are 4 world empires there. You cannot get a fifth empire out of that image. And you look at the toes and the feet, it's iron mixed with clay, but he's very clear in the context. It's the same empire. It's the Roman Empire. And why is the clay and the iron there? It seems to be, looking and studying that, it seems to be an indication of the unrest and the strife within the Roman Empire that characterized it later on. And you can study your world history, just secular history, and you'll see that. A lot of strife, especially as it began to wane and eventually got ready to fall. But those 4 world empires are very, very important because they all work together and set up the fullness of time. And what happens in the fullness of time? Galatians 4:4. God sends forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. We can be sons of God through the fullness of time and Jesus coming into this world and offering himself, living a sinless life, died on the cross, a sacrificial death, and now we can come to God through him. The 4 world empires, those are very, very important. I'll save more of that until we get to the intertestamental period, because they come into play a lot when you start talking about the intertestamental period. But Babylon, led by Nebuchadnezzar, he says, you're the head of gold, no mistake in that. Can't really mistake the Medo-Persian Empire there. Greece is hard to mistake as well. Greece being Alexander the Great. And of course his kingdom's going to be left to 4 different people. He didn't have an heir, and it's going to split into 4. None of them were really anywhere even remotely as strong or powerful or as good a leader as Alexander the Great. In fact, they're often fighting amongst themselves, and it's eventually going to give way to the Roman Empire. But it's a fascinating study. I'm still working out how I want to approach that during our I think we'll have 2 or maybe 3 weeks to cover intertestamental period, but there's so much that could be said about that. And one of these days, I want to teach a class where we can spend 13 weeks or so and just study that intertestamental period, because it's an amazing study to get you bridge that gap between the Old and New Testaments, but also it's very faith building, because you see so many prophecies, So detailed. We've said it before. Daniel chapter 11. The modernists, they scramble to late date the book of Daniel because they don't believe in predictive, miraculous prophecy. And so what do you do with Daniel 11 if you don't believe in miraculous predictive prophecy? I mean, it is so detailed that the only thing you can do is either accept it for what it is, or, well, okay, let's just scramble. Well, Daniel actually was writing, concurrent events. Current events. He's not writing prophecy. He's writing stuff that's happening, and so that's why it was so detailed. No, the evidence is there. It was written when it's claimed to be written during the captivity, and those prophecies are just nothing short of amazing, and they're very faith-building, but to help us to know with certainty that the Bible is, in fact, the Word of God. Those four world empires, so important. I will tell you this very quickly. Babylonian Empire, they all contributed in very unique ways to the fullness of time. The Babylonian Empire, what's the major contribution? You may or may not remember this from the Book of the Month study on the intertestamental period, or we've mentioned it before, I think. Anybody remember what Babylon contributed? Well, you're thinking of a different empire. Although Babylonian Empire probably did contribute a strong sense of law, but even in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, he might make a law and decide, I'm not going to follow that. I'm the king. Babylonian Empire, think in terms of synagogue worship. Remember, I think we did touch on this just a week or two ago, that they didn't have the temple. It's destroyed. And even if they had the temple, even if it was still standing, they're in captivity. What do you do to worship God? Well, these communities of the captives they would put together a synagogue. And they would gather together. And synagogue worship, when you study this in history, it's very, very similar to New Testament worship. It was simple. They would sing. They would pray. Obviously they didn't partake of the Lord's Supper, but they would sing. They would pray. They even would contribute and have like a treasury, a fund where they could do different things, help those that were in need and things like that. But very, very similar. They would, of course, proclaim the Word of God as well. But minus the Lord's Supper, it's very, very similar to New Testament worship. Medo-Persian Empire. This one, I think, Bob, you mentioned law. This is probably the one where law really is, you see a real strong emphasis on law, because at least a couple of times during the Medo-Persian Empire, one is in Daniel chapter 6, one is in the book of Esther, where there's a law, and it's signed into law, and even the king himself can't alter it. The law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. That's how the King James puts it. Daniel, they tricked him into signing this law. If anybody prays to anybody except for the king, Darius, then, they're going to be thrown into a lion's den. Daniel, of course, keeps praying to God. They go and tell the king. The king loved Daniel, and he seeks to get Daniel released, but they remind him, you signed the law. You can't alter it. Well, that strict sense of law is going to be important, because later on you're going to have men like Paul, and they're going to take him aside, and they're going to say, we're going to find out what this guy's done. The Jews are so upset with him. So just take him over here and scourge him real good until he tells us what's going on. And they get ready to scourge him, and what happens? Paul says, hey, time out. Quick question for you here. Is it legal to scourge a man who's a Roman citizen? And now they all go like, what? Whoa, time out. You're a Roman citizen? Yeah, I am. Okay, they say, hey, take heed what you do with this man. He's a citizen. He's got rights as a citizen. And Paul was not afraid to use those. In fact, one occasion he says, if I'm an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But I haven't done anything worthy of death. And so, that being the case, he says, I appeal to Caesar. And what did they say? Oh, no, we don't have to listen to that. They say, well, he's a Roman citizen. He appeals to Caesar, and so they say, to Caesar you must go. That's the way it's going to be. So law and order. Greece, what was the contribution? Language. It was a nearly universal language. In fact, when you get to the New Testament, a lot of folks typically were trilingual. It was not uncommon at all. Probably the common language would be Greek. Koine Greek, as we often call it. Common is what that word means. Common Greek. And then you had Latin. That was kind of the state language of Rome. And then you had, especially among the Jews, Hebrew or Aramaic. So you see that a lot. In fact, of course, you're probably thinking, as I am, of the cross of Jesus, the inscription, King of the Jews, written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And then you get to the Roman Empire, and what was their contribution? Roads. In fact, what's the expression? All roads lead to Rome. And we've noted before, probably be more accurately stated, all roads lead from Rome, because they all went out from Rome. But that's the expression, all roads lead to Rome. And when you got good roads, and you also have, I'm trying to remember the Latin term. Somebody may have to help me if you know any Latin. Is it Pax Romanus? Which means what? Peace of Rome. Again, that law and order. You could travel these roads, and and a lot of times you travel anywhere in ancient times, and it was kind of rolling the dice, because there were a lot of pirates, there were a lot of people that would try to do you harm. But in Rome, they had this nice road system, and they had peace, and there was law and order. And not to say it never happened, but it was a lot less common. And that helps with the spread of the gospel. So when the kingdom begins, we mentioned that earlier, the kingdom is not some, in our time, some yet to be established entity. It is established. Jesus prophesied it. He talked about it. John prophesied it. But when you get to Acts chapter 2, it comes into existence, and from that point forward, it's spoken of in the present tense. So much of Daniel deals with these world kingdoms, and they come into play so much in leading up to the entrance of the Messiah into the world. Our memory verse, Matthew 7:21. Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father, which is in heaven. Well, that's little, isn't it? Good thing we all got that memorized, right? All right, so let's go into period number 12. I think everybody's got their handouts now. This is the restoration or the return from captivity. Again, this is last period of Old Testament history. We'll have an overview of what happens in between, and that'll conclude our study at that time. But this period of restoration, return, is going to cover from what? The decree of Cyrus, but allows the Jews to return home, to chronologically to the end of Nehemiah's work. The decree of Cyrus is somewhere around 536 BC, and the end of Nehemiah's work is going to be somewhere around 430 BC. That's, again, that's kind of an average. So you can see, we often talk about the 400 years between the Testaments. That's an approximation, a little more than that actually, but that's what this this period covers. Where do we read about it in the Bible? We know we read about it in portions of Daniel. Somebody mentioned Ezra. What else? Nehemiah. And also Esther. So all those books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther obviously are all within that period. Portions of Daniel fall in that period. All right. Important places. Just a couple here. What would they be? Jerusalem, obviously. That's going to be very important because they're returning home and they return to Jerusalem. And yes, Persia. I think that's right. Anybody? I'd have to look at a map. Bob, are you familiar, Johnny? Modern day Iraq, Iran. Babylon would be Iraq. Aaron, you've been over there. Iran, Iraq area, kind of. That's the Persian area. Of course, the modern day boundaries are different from how these, especially when they were big, huge world empires. In fact, Aaron was telling me Where was it we were talking about? It was just a week or two ago that you'd been to. Ur. Yeah, had been to see the ruins of Ur of the Chaldees. Pretty fascinating stuff, which was discovered, I think, in the 1800s. An archaeological dig found that. You know, for years, skeptics would accuse the Bible of just making up Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham didn't. He didn't live in Ur of the Chaldees, in no such place. They just made it up. Well, they found it, and it's actually a pretty impressive place. In fact, that's what Aaron was telling me that day after class, is that he'd actually been there, I guess stationed over there, right? And oh, okay, just stopped there and got to check that out. But he said it was fascinating. I would love to go and visit a place like that. Just amazing stuff. Archaeology, we often say, is the best friend of the Bible, because it, over and over again, it's not that we couldn't know the Bible is God's Word without it, but boy, it is faith building to see these discoveries that confirm what the Bible has said all along. Important people in this period number 12. There's several of them, actually. Ezra is going to be important. Let's start with, where does this period begin? Yeah, the decree of King Cyrus. So Cyrus is going to be an important person. He's the king of Persia at this time. Who's going to lead our first return? Zerubbabel. He's going to be an important person. I don't read a ton about him, but he is a key person because he led that first return. And then you have, who's high priest at this time? Ezra's a priest, but he's not the high priest. Joshua or Jeshua, the high priest of Israel. And then, of course, Ezra, he's going to lead our second return. And it's interesting, you know, we've mentioned it before, 3 carryings away into captivity, 3 returns from captivity. Who else? There's a whole book of the Bible dedicated to this one young lady, Esther, and her cousin, Mordecai, or Mordecai, depending on how you want to pronounce that, who they together helped to save the Jewish people from annihilation. And then who's going to lead the third return? Nehemiah. He leads the third return from captivity. And then you have some prophets in this section who are going to be important. Haggai, Zechariah. Man, a lot of messianic prophecy in the book of Zechariah. And, of course, the last book is Malachi. Again, not always, you know, in chronological order as they appear. They're grouped together. You know, we've talked before about the groupings of the Old Testament, so it's not always chronological. But Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, these prophets come into play quite a bit during this period, exhorting the people, encouraging the people, many times calling them back to God. Especially with Haggai, they left off building God's house and started tending to their own houses. And Haggai says, is it time for you to dwell in your sealed houses while this house, talking about the Lord's house, lies waste? Consider your ways. We still use that expression, heard lots of sermons just from that one little phrase. All right, let's get a few verses in advance. Boy, time gets away, doesn't it? I mentioned this earlier, in 538 BC, the Medes and the Persians, they defeat Babylon somewhere around 538 BC. They're led by Cyrus the Great. That empire is called the Medo-Persian Empire. And then around 536, he makes a decree that allows the Jews to return home. We'll unpack that a little bit more next week. I'll go ahead and get the rest of this first slide up here of verses and events. Isaiah prophesied what Cyrus was going to do. This was over 100 years before Cyrus was even born. You know, it would be one thing to say, not to say that it wouldn't be impressive even then, to say as they're in captivity and it looks like that's just going to be the way it's going to be, to say, well, you know, one day there's going to be a guy come along and he's going to set you free. Well, that would be, like I said, it's not that that wouldn't be impressive, but to say there's going to be a man and his name is Cyrus, my shepherd, God calls him there in the book of Isaiah, and we'll look at that next week, Lord willing. But Isaiah prophesied it, called him by name over 100 years before he was even born. They read that prophecy to him, and he says, hey, God's anointed me. He's tapped me to be the man to let you all return home, and he does. Jeremiah prophesied, we've mentioned it before, captivity would be 70 years, at which time God would visit them and bring them home. Again, we'll unpack some of that a little bit more next week, but I did want to mention that. And then we'll also next week talk about those 3 returns and a little bit more about them. Time flies. And also don't let me forget, I'm forgetful, we'll go over your review, periods 8 through 12. That'll be our kind of final exam, final review. That's an open note test, so feel free to use your handouts and your notes that you have, and you should be able to find all the answers, especially the dates. I know dates are sometimes difficult. But thank you very much. We'll pick up right there, Lord willing, next week and cover that. We'll plan to finish period number 12 next week. I don't know if we'll get into the review, but we'll go over that at some point. So thank you very much. We'll have a short break before our worship this morning.